With the original Scream trilogy being a bona fide hit in the 90s, the Weinsteins weren't ready to give up the ghost, and Scream 4 introduced us to a litany of lambs being led to the slaughter. But how does that new generation compare to the old? Let's find out as we rank all 20 Scream 4 characters from worst to best. What is up, Scream team? Zach Cherry here. Guys, I started this channel because I'm a huge horror geek, and if you're like me, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on those bell notifications so that you can be alerted to all my latest videos, including news, reviews, and rankings, just like this one. Just for shits and gigs, toss this video a thumbs up. It'll let YouTube know that you're interested in seeing more Scream-related content, as well as help this channel to grow. Going over some quick caveats for these rankings, these are my personal opinions. You don't have to agree with me, but rather than getting all bent out of shape about it, why not be constructive and let me know what your rankings are by commenting them down below. Just like my video for the characters from the first 3 Scream movies, every character is being ranked relative to their appearance in the film in which we're covering. And lastly, I'm specifically ranking the characters who receive a pictured credit at the end of the movie, which in the case of Scream 4 is pretty much all of them. To streamline this process, I'm gonna cheat a little and break the characters from the opening scene into 3 pairs rather than 6 individuals. But guess what? My rankings, my rules. You can obviously rank the characters however you would like, but I just wanted to make sense of this so it wasn't confusing when I started counting down from 17. Got it? Good. Let's start ranking. Coming in last place is Rachel and Chloe. Like I said in my Scream 3 rankings, there were quite a few main credited characters who could have just been relegated to uncredited cameo status. And for the Scream 4, or rather Stab 7 cast, nobody rings more true to that than Anna Paquin and Kristen Bell. There's nothing wrong with their performances per se, but this is a ranking of the film's characters, and these two received the least amount of characterization. This doesn't mean they're seen as my least favorite of the triple opening, but instead that these are characters that I have no strong feelings towards, good or bad. And that apathy is enough to land any character right at the bottom of these rankings. Next up, in what might be the biggest question mark on this list, is Kate Roberts. It is interesting to note that the role of Jill's mother was originally intended to be much larger, with Lauren Graham set to play the part, but with days to go before filming, Graham left the movie due to a scheduling conflict, as well as last-minute changes to the script. Considering how little Kate is in the movie, roughly 2 minutes of screen time by my estimate, I'm not sure how Graham couldn't find the time to shoot all of her scenes, so I imagine she just had no interest in being a glorified extra. Unfortunately, most of Kate's characterization can be found in other characters talking about her, or reading text on a computer screen. It's a shame because there is a lot of intrigue to her being Maureen's sister, who was the catalyst for this franchise, and you would think that a movie with strong themes of family ties would have all of Sidney's relatives be more prevalent. In 15th place is Olivia Morris. This is a character whose sole purpose is to get killed off with as little development as possible, and boy does she ever get killed off. If this was a ranking for kills, she would definitely not be scoring this low. But if the most memorable thing you did in a Scream movie was die, the time you spent being alive probably didn't have that much of an impact, and judging by her friend's blasé attitude towards her murder by the next day, I wouldn't say she had much of an impact on them either. Even if they hadn't cut the extra scenes she appeared in, we wouldn't have been any the wiser to who Olivia was, besides missing out on her best line from the movie, which offers up some ironic foreshadowing.
Time for someone new to die.
How meta can you get? Unlike Olivia though, a character who would have benefited from a little extra screen time was Trevor Sheldon. And if it seems like this generation's Billy Loomis was a mere shadow of his predecessor, that's because almost all of his scenes were cut from the movie. I will say that those deleted scenes do provide a lot more context to the story and adds depth to his relationship with Jill, which in and of itself falls rather flat. However, Nico Tortorella's performance is all over the map. Just to break down all the different interpretations we see of Trevor, there was doting boyfriend, creepy stalker, lovesick puppy dog, meathead jock, and lovable goof. Either way, Craven himself said on the film's commentary that most of Trevor's scenes were removed because he was appearing to be too much of a red herring. But I can't help but feel that it might have had more to do with this character never landing right. Not to instantiate my feelings about Scream 4 overall, as this is just a character ranking, and I do plan on doing a proper review in the future future, but I do think that the movie was much more realized in its original uncut format. Thankfully, Xanart1982 on Instagram provided me with a high quality edit, which includes the alternate opening, deleted scenes from the American and European releases, as well as a post-credits sequence, which all runs over 2 hours long. I'll put a link down in the description so you can check it out for yourself and let me know how it compares to the theatrical cut. In 13th place is Jenny and Marnie, the real first kills of Scream 4. It's always difficult to rank the opening characters as they're so intrinsically linked to the action of the scene itself that it doesn't leave much room for personal evaluation. And because of the setup of the double fake out, by the time we get to these two, I've kind of become desensitized to the tension and terror these pre-title kills are so famously recognized for. If this opening does seem a little gimmicky to you and nowhere near as horrifying as the Scream 2 opening scene, for instance, that's because it relies way more on surprise than it does on suspense. To best explain this, Alfred Hitchcock once described the difference between surprise and suspense. Surprise being when two people are sitting in a coffee shop and a bomb goes off under the table. Suspense being when we see that bomb ticking away under the table while the two characters are completely unaware that it's even there. With the opening kills from Scream 2, the audience knows the bomb is there, in this case that these characters are going to get brutally murdered in about 10 minutes time. So we spend that 10 minutes in suspense by watching the events unfold leading up to that moment. With Scream 4's opening, by condensing the whole thing into 3 segments, it loses its momentum of suspense, and similarly its hold on the audience, as we've now been conditioned to expect a surprise instead. When the big moment does finally come, it acts as more of a punchline than a release, and because of that, Jenny and Marnie's deaths fall way too short of becoming anywhere near as iconic as Phil and Maureen's. In 12th place is Officer Ross Hoss. I've said time and time again that other than Dewey, the police shouldn't be anything more than a peripheral presence in a Scream movie, as their inclusion leans heavily towards procedural action. I see Ghostface as more of a spectral entity, and when you put so much emphasis on law enforcement involvement, it detracts from the horror and makes the killing seem so commonplace. In terms of casting, it's kind of weird for me to see Adam Brody in such a minor role in a Scream movie, as he was probably one of the more recognizable faces at the time, and in a way it's very distracting. With so many characters in the mix, it might have been better to have lesser known actors play the smaller roles, so more time could be devoted to the more important people. And based on that decision, this has always felt like stunt casting to me. I wouldn't say the same thing about Anthony Anderson though, who was already an established genre vet by this point, having appeared in the urban legends and scary movie franchises. As Officer Anthony Perkins, the most obvious psycho reference to date, he manages to rank slightly higher than his partner based on having a way cooler death scene alone. But Perkins and Hoss are still played mostly for comedic effect, and while not as silly as the characters from Scream 3, they still embody that proverbial clown cop trope which the horror genre has never been able to shake. Thanks a lot, Halloween 5. As the sole black representative of Scream 4, Anderson is definitely more involved with the story compared to Tyson from Scream 3, but it is rather disappointing that after 11 years between sequels, the best they could do was to once again have no more than one black character who is primarily remembered for dropping quips right up to and during his death scene. In 10th place is Charlie Walker. Those of you who've seen my Scream Killer rankings will know that Charlie was decidedly the worst character to have donned the ghost-faced mask. I think the problem with him as the killer is that it was such an uninspired choice. One of the great things that makes Matthew Lillard's performance from Scream 1 so compelling is that you can watch it forward and backwards and interpret it in 2 very different ways. One where you see the character as someone in Sidney's friend group, and the other where you can see that this is actually a disturbed sociopath who's getting off on all the chaos unfolding around him. With Charlie, it is of course explained at the end that he is a disturbed sociopath, but there's no nuance to his character throughout the film that marks his reveal as anything less than a surprise. surprise. And you know how I feel about surprises. I think it would be considered an honor to be one of the killers in these movies, and for that reason, I always hold them to a higher standard than everyone else, because they have a responsibility to live up to the reputation of all the killers that came before them. I just wish there was more to unravel with his character. I would have liked to have seen more moments with all the kids together earlier on, with some subtle interactions between him and Jill, just to give us some sort of Easter egg that we could look back at and think, aha, that's how I knew it was them. I do think Rory Culkin was set up for a loss though, just because the script poses him strictly as Jill's lackey. But Charlie the Killer aside, as Charlie the president of the cinema club, Culkin lacks a certain level of panache, as his characterization and knowledge of horror feels more programmed than authentic. When I think of Jamie Kennedy making horror references as Randy, I can actually feel that character's personality and experience in those lines, which I never get a sense of with Charlie. In ninth place is Deputy Judy Hicks. I know a lot of people don't really like Hicks all that much, but being a fan of Valentine and Planet Terror, I was very happy to see Marley Shelton turn up here. I think they could have done a lot worse with Hicks, to be honest, as at least compared to the rest of the Woodsboro Police Department, we have a better sense of who she is by her relationships and interactions with the other characters. I even find her rivalry with Gale to be quite whimsical, which I know isn't a term one should ever have to use to describe anything about a Scream movie, though I think I might have enjoyed her more if they had played up the creepy red herring angle. The scene where she emerges from the shadows is one of my favorite little character moments from the whole film, even if it feels inconsistent with the vibe she had given off earlier. In eighth place is Rebecca Walters. I wanted to rank Rebecca dead last because this character feels like she's ripped right out of the Scream 3 script. Tone-wise, she doesn't really fit in with the slightly more serious shift this movie takes, and her lack of emotional intelligence feels very forced as a way to easily get her out of the way early on. Despite that, however, I do really enjoy Alison Brie's performance. I think Rebecca is a lot better than most of the Scream 3 characters, and certainly leapfrogged over most of the Scream 4 characters here when I reevaluated my decision. But like most of the Scream 3 characters, she's just another douchebag that I don't really give a shit about. I don't necessarily think every victim in these movies needs to be a saint in order for us to fear for their life, but Gale wasn't the most likable character in Scream 1, yet she was still interesting and we cared about her because the script made her relatable. Rebecca is a cardboard cutout, and I think if she'd been written with just a few more layers, she wouldn't have felt so disposable. Falling 5 spots from Scream 3 is Dewey Riley. I don't know what happened here, but they really shit the bed when it came to paying the Dewster his dues. He completely disappears in this movie, and what's worse is we've got Jiggity Judy and the bumbling clown cops to pad his role for him. I guess that as sheriff, he now has a bunch of bureaucratic red tape to cut through and was off dealing with that for most of the movie, but even then, he's completely ineffectual. Obviously, with all the younger cast coming on, other characters had to get sidelined, and he got the short end of the stick, but that's even more reason to get frustrated with the script, as it devoted so much of its time early on in establishing this conflict between Dewey and Gale, only to half-ass its resolution by the end of the second act. And this is inherently what is wrong with most of the character stories in this movie, which I will touch upon in a bit here, but I can't help to think that this movie would have benefited from either developing this conflict more or just scrapping it all together. In sixth place is Sherry and Trudy. I didn't expect to rank these two this high, but I actually really enjoy the hell out of their scene. In terms of chemistry, Lucy Hale and Sinead Grimes were a perfect duo and definitely made up the best segment of the opening scene, which is probably the most traditional one too if I were to compare it to the original movie. But what I like the most about it is that their dialogue is so on point and feels like peak Kevin Williamson writing. It's actually kind of depressing when you consider that these aren't really characters in this movie and that they're way more interesting and entertaining than most of the boring teenagers who do make up the main cast. In fifth place is Robbie Mercer. While making up this list, I definitely noticed a pattern in which the male characters in this movie are written to be quite inferior, with Kevin Williamson being an openly gay man who has shown he has a knack for writing straight male characters. It seems quite odd that he would all of a sudden drop the ball now, which leads me to believe that it was the rewrites scripts that were carried out by Aaron Kruger and a team of uncredited writers where this screenplay lost its male voice. Robbie stands out to me because I see Kevin Williamson in this character. I can see 15 years worth of Kevin Williamson's characters in this character. And I know there's debate on whether or not Robbie was actually gay, which if he was, would make him the first and only gay character in a Scream movie to my recollection. Oh, and I guess this guy?
Don't ask, don't tell.
I think if the rewrites had done a better job with realizing the film's male characters and maybe recalibrating the number of its characters overall, Robbie could have had more of a lasting impression. But for what we got, I'd say he did alright. So an interesting thing about all 4 Scream movies is that each one of them is so narratively different from the other. The first movie tells a straightforward murder mystery mainly through one character's perspective, while the sequel offers more of a soap opera style format where we alternate between 2 main storylines until they converge at the end. The third movie follows a similar structure, but is a tonal disaster, and then that leads us to this movie, which for all intents and purposes is one singular storyline in which all of its characters, not including the Stabverse, exist in the same narrative. The problem though is that there is no definable lead character. Instead, we have several characters who have lead potential, but their involvement is more plot-driven than it is character-driven. So I'm going to use that as a jumping-off point to grade these next 4 characters, discuss what I liked, what I didn't like, and how they could have been improved. So that's going to take us right into 4th place with Gale Weathers. In doing these 4 rankings now, I've come to realize that Gale is the best character, or at least she's my favorite character. Out of the big 3, she's evolved the most. She's the funniest, she's the most complex, she has the most raw emotion, and I have a full grasp on who she is and what her motivations and aspirations are. And for someone who started out as a bit side player, she's become even more realized than Sidney herself. Having said that, I don't think Scream 4 is Gale's movie. I think with Scream 4, it could have been a really good opportunity to give the character of Sidney the chance to have more personal development with its themes of family and the stigma of her victimhood. I can appreciate the dilemma though, as Courtney Cox has become such an important fixture in these movies that it would feel bizarre to just have her show up as a background character, as it feels only natural that Gale would spring into action the moment these murders started up again. But if they weren't able to write a compelling arc for her character in Scream 4, I almost would have preferred her not be in the movie at all. As annoying as it is that the big 3 do seem invincible, I'm glad Gale didn't die, because if Courtney is coming back for Scream 5, there needs to be a damn good reason for it. I don't want to see my favorite character given anything less than what she deserves. In 3rd place is Jill Roberts. You know, Emma Roberts is amazing, and I love her in everything she does. And Jill being revealed as the killer was such a good twist, just given how the movie was setting her up to be the new Sidney Prescott. Her reveal at the end and ensuing bad guy speech and self-mutilation is without question the best part of this whole movie. Unfortunately, everything we get from her before the reveal is very underwhelming. I don't really get a sense of who this character is, or at least who she's trying to make us think she is. The #1 rule of screenwriting is show, don't tell. But what do I know? I'm not a screenwriter. But throughout the movie, we just hear Jill talking about the horrible stuff happening and how it's affecting her, but we don't see it affecting her. Compare that to the first Scream movie, where we literally see Sidney falling apart to the point where you can feel her trauma. Obviously, Jill is the killer and she doesn't actually feel anything, but that doesn't mean that we as an audience shouldn't be fooled into believing that she is. We could have gotten some real good Gone Girl style unreliable narration to really hook us into the character, only to gut punch our emotions later on. So yeah, the first time around Jill's reveal is shocking, but when I rewatch this movie, I'm not really thinking, wow, she's really believable at faking being the victim, as I'm more so biding my time until we get to Emma's tour de force at the end. It makes her performance feel more like a sprint than a marathon, and again, I think this has a lot to do with the allocation of screen time. If more of the movie's focus had been placed on Jill, it could have allowed for that optimal characterization. In In second place is Sidney Prescott. Outside of the first movie, this is Sidney's best turnout. I think in Scream 2, Gale had the better story, and we all know how Scream 3 turned out with Neve Campbell's limited schedule, so it was nice to see Sidney finally get more involvement in the story, and to give Neve some better material to work with. But unfortunately, it's still not enough. I like that she was presented as being stronger, smarter, braver, and more resourceful, but it feels like we missed out on that character development. Like, it all happened in the 10-year hiatus. Woohoo, you wrote a book, and now you're properly equipped to deal with serial killers, but we didn't get to see how she got to this point. This is why I think Gale is a better character. We got to live that experience with her and watch her grow through these movies. With Sidney, shit happens to her, but then she goes off and processes that on her own. It just makes for a marginally less interesting character. That's not to say Sidney is not interesting. I think she's plenty intriguing, but she's the type of character who internalizes everything. There's just too much left to be desired. Like, I want to know more about this book. I want to know what her breaking point was to start writing it. I want to know what happened to her father, and I want to know how that affected her. But I don't want to just know it, I want to see it. Remember, show, don't tell. We know Sidney is one of the best, if not the best, final girls ever, but the sequels kind of just throw her into these scenarios and offer up the bare minimum, and the writing always has this lazy feel to it, like, alright, she's here, let's wrap it up. And I don't want to speak for any of you, but a lot of the criticisms I hear about the franchise is just how predictable the final acts are. I don't think it's the predictability that's the problem though, it's the character's lack of externalizing her inner conflict. In the case of Scream 4, we had that with Sidney grappling with the idea of being a victim versus being a survivor. But then there was no follow through to this. Sidney had little autonomy by the end of the movie. She survives because the script needed her to, not by any will of her own. If you compare that to the original, where she outwits Billy and Stu by literally challenging them at their own game, you can see how much of a difference that makes in her characterization. I want to see Scream 5 get this character right. I want to see Sidney be the main character again and own that script. I think it's possible, but it might require for the story to focus solely on her and not deviate between multiple storylines or saturate the cast with 15 to 20 new faces. But that's not to say all those characters are completely useless, because just when you think things can't get any worse, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get better. Out of Darkness by Sidney Prescott, page 220. And out of that darkness we shall go with this next character who, dead or alive, definitely earns this top spot in the Scream 4 rankings. And that character, of course, is Kirby Reed. We've seen countless new characters added to the cast with every new entry, and despite having few survivors, none of them have ever shown up for the next movie. None of them have ever been worthy enough to show up for the next movie. And I suppose that's conditioned us to always rely on the big three to headline each new sequel. And if they do continue making Scream movies well into the future, we're not always going to be able to rely on the legacy characters to be there for us. So at some point, we're gonna have to start over with an all-new cast of characters, or do what Scream 4 had originally set out to do and pass the torch over to somebody worthy of sitting in that Scream Queen throne. And I do believe that Kirby would have been that character. Even compared to Jill, Kirby is the character more in the driver's seat here. We're introduced to her first, we are given a sense of who she is, what she wants, who she wants, all wrapped up in this guise of a manic pixie dream girl. She's playful and cavalier, but also is self-aware and has this mature undertone to her that suggests she's one major trauma away from being a fully realized final girl. And as much as this movie is narratively fooling us to believe that Jill is the final girl, it's cognitively hinting to us that Kirby is, based on the greater emotional connection she has with the audience. The debate on whether or not Kirby is alive by the end of the movie notwithstanding, Hayden Panettiere was cast with a no-kill clause in her contract, and with the way they had originally written the ending of the movie to segue into the would-have-been Scream 5, it was supposed to be set up to reveal that she was in fact found alive and would have likely joined Jill in the sequel, unaware of her bestie's betrayal. But since things worked out the way they did, there's no telling what that continuity would have looked like. Regardless, Kirby was a breath of fresh air amidst a large cast of disposable characters, and she would have been a very worthy successor to Sidney, and still could be if they found the right way to bring her back. This of course brings my Scream character ranking series to a close, at least until Scream 5 is released. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't already seen my rankings for the first 3 Scream movies or my rankings for all of the Ghostface killers, I will link those up on the screen for you right now, as well as in the descriptions down below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.